Okay, I've got some themes to cover, so I've prepared. Susan has prepared me very, very well, and you, of course. We've got 5 minutes, so we've got 40, 45 minutes before we come to a close, but we've got questions and answers from the audience, and they are a very interactive audience. I've seen them in action, some actors in there as well. Can we maybe ask you, Alex, can you start off by sharing some of the journey that you've been on? That sounds deep.
Yeah, it's been something. It's been a privilege, really, obviously. And I tend to talk a lot, so tell me to shut up. Yeah, thank you. So I'm descended from enslavers, from a Scottish family, the Fergusons of Ayrshire, who, like many others, well, not that many others, I suppose, invested in plantations and brought African people back in the 18th century. And very briefly, this was a secret in my family. Some of you will know of them. The house New Hales, the National Trust House just outside Edinburgh, was one of the houses associated with them. They lived there at the end of the enslavement period when they profited from the compensation paid to enslavers when slavery was abolished. Plantation slavery was abolished. And this was a secret. We were brought up to admire our ancestors who'd been the great people who'd run the greatest empire ever, I quote, and soldiers and politicians and so on. And I stumbled across the facts in the basement of the house in Ayrshire where my grandparents lived. About 8 years ago, when I was a rainy afternoon, I was looking at piles of family papers, which my grandfather had catalogued, and I kept seeing the words Jamaica and Tobago. And I asked my mum, and she said, yes. And my dad said something about this, but he said, we didn't make much money, we didn't do it for very long, and everyone else was doing it. That was the quote. Meaning everyone else of their landowner elite class. So that was the beginning of the journey, really, and it took me to Jamaica and Tobago, because as soon as I'd read these papers, I had to go and talk to the people there about what I should do, really. And what people like me should do, because clearly there were millions of us with that inheritance. And then I published the book. And yes, in a small way, I hope we as a group, and there are others, some are more famous than me, like Charles Gladstone, Laura Trevelyan, and so on, who have similarly acknowledged that past and started to talk about supporting or allying with descendants of the enslaved, if they wish us to, in supporting the movements for reparative justice, which seems to me overdue, long overdue, and more necessary than ever. And I think what we've heard today shows that. And more necessary in Scotland too. I've been involved a bit with the Church of England scheme, paltry though it is, to begin Church of England's reparative justice, but not happening with the Church of Scotland yet. It's not happening with the Free Church in Scotland either. And that's something we Scots, and I'm an Edinburgher myself, might start thinking about addressing. And I've talked to some of you here, we've discussed this already and how we might go about that as a movement. But I just very briefly on Hume, if I can. So 4 of my direct grandfathers were directly involved and benefited from enslaving, in the end, over 1,000 people in Tobago and Jamaica. I find it's still emotional to say it, actually, especially with many of you here. And Hume, so the key ancestor, Sir Adam Ferguson, was rector of Glasgow University. He was a MP for Edinburgh and so on. Very much part of the Scottish Enlightenment elite. And he bought Hume's books. He would have known Hume. 20 years younger, but they were they were both the founding members of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So they were definitely, it was a small society, that white elite. I think using enlightenment is now kind of risible as a word, given how so many of them made their wealth, exploiting people both in Scotland and all over the world. But one of the real reasons I wanted to tell my family story was because they were Christians, they were liberals. Sir Adam owned a copy of Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. They at the forefront of the liberty movements, the democratic movements of the late 18th century. But they clearly, and I won't go into some of the details, they're in my book, and I won't encourage you to read them about how they treated the enslaved African people. They clearly saw African people, people of that different skin color, as less than human. And it's absolutely obvious. They treat the indentured white workers they sent from Scotland, the children of their tenants in Ayrshire, very well. They're always asking after their health, and now they're being looked after, and when they die, whether their belongings are going to be returned to their mothers and so on. But the things they do to the Africans are what you would do to a farm animal. I will go into no more detail. But and Hume gave them the excuse. Hume, and often when I sit down with book festival audiences or arguing with right-wing newspapers selling this book, people go, well, slavery is part of the human condition. It's always been there. Why don't we sue the Romans for enslaving us 2,000 years ago? And I go, and I'm echoing much greater minds than mine, and David Olusoga among them. You don't understand is my class, my ancestors industrialized it, and we did it, unlike slavery anywhere else, on an entirely racist basis. My ancestors, Sir Adam, my grandfathers could not have enslaved a white person, but they could enslave a black person, but both legally and morally. They made the laws, but they cleared their consciences as Christians because they read Hume and they took him seriously. So he, like so many philosophers, planted a seed that allowed a form of genocide and enabled slavery to continue far longer than it would naturally have done, I think, right up until 1838. So that's my story.
That's powerful. And sorry to interrupt the flow, but when we talk about being uncomfortable, I don't think any man who's faced that uncomfortableness any deeper than yourself, Alex.
But the thing is, I'm not a survivor or any kind of. I have never suffered racism. I've heard much more racism since I published this book, and I've encountered, and people, half my family will never speak to me again. But I haven't suffered racism. I'm a hugely privileged person. I don't have any money that comes from that what my ancestors did, but I certainly have privilege that came from what they did. And I had the privilege to be able to find that archive and get the book published. So, yes, I mean, it's quite a ride, but I'm not the one who suffers the legacies of the enslavement era, which continue to tarnish our country and our society, and the Caribbean nations and the West African nations to this day.
A lot of depth. Well, Tommy, I'll come to you next, if that's okay. As to get a little bit of your reflections and thoughts.
On enslavement or scowling?
Yourself, just tell, you have 5 minutes for.
Well, as you can probably tell, I'm not from Scotland. I'm from the United States. All right. I grew up in the South. I was born at the very end of segregation in the United States. I was born in 1979. And I find many of the conversations that Scotland has, along with the UK, somewhat culturally alienating, because there is a discomfort that the society at large has in discussing issues of racism and anti-Blackness. But in terms of resistance, racial consciousness, these things differ very greatly from where I come from. I was taught about Blackness. I was taught not to trust white people because my life depended on that knowledge as a 4-year-old Black boy in the South. So when we talk about legacies of enslavement and colonialism, there are very shameful parts in terms of what white people did to construct Black people as animals and non-human. But what I've seen in the politeness of the Scottish society is an attempt to reconcile and recover, to revalorize and to repair many of these legacies that we see in the work of Hume, Dugald Stewart, Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith, etc. So we end up having conversations about race and racism that very much entertain how the white elite and educated majority want to feel about their history and legacy, to the expense of how Black people and African descended people define their own suffering and trauma. What I mean by that is that we live in a society and we are operating in institutions still run, controlled, and funded by white people. So we are constantly mediating what we say and how we want to understand these issues based on the sentiment of those who have power. Now, if you look at any colonial society, that society was managed, run, funded, and institutionalized by white people. Black people become enslaved workers stained by their skin color precisely because they're not allowed to govern themselves, determine themselves, decide their own aspirations, or dictate their own knowledge base. So then I ask myself, in a society of white Scotlanders who want to start this conversation, how does the management of their society and government differ? It is a society still run by white people. It is a knowledge base still dictated by white people's history. And now the question becomes, well, is this history stained? Of course it is. But that stain can't be repaired. It can't be washed out. Because the suffering and deaths of the blood of the Black people who built Edinburgh, who had families profit, as you discussed, they're no longer here to get that repair. We're being forced to have a conversation under the confines of assuming that everyone's sorry. And I can tell you, doing this work for 15 years, even being here for 6 years, not everyone is in fact sorry. So the legacies of racism and enslavement are not simply about the suffering of the people, of the Black people who died, who were made human chattel. It is in instituting systems of government and knowledge where Black people can't determine their own interests, their own aspirations, and their own fate. Now, white supremacy operates in that way. It operates in a way where it can resist criticism. This conversation that's happening now will fade in 10 years, right? The Black people that we see here, as a Black professor, at some point, my time will end. There's a good chance there won't be any other Black professors in Scotland. This is the reality that we have to deal with given racism and institutional discrimination. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what's at stake in questioning the legacy of Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment? Scotlanders want to be proud of something where they think they invented humanity. But at the same time, the same ethics that you see Hume appeal to, Douglas Stewart appeal to, created subhumanity. It was in the minds of white people, not Black people, that Black people weren't persons. This was not a debate to be had among Black people about whether or not they had cognition or believed in God or had cultures and societies and governments. These are questions that white people asked about Black culture. So now we're forced to have a debate where we're entertaining, well, did anyone tell Hume he was wrong? You mean, did a white person tell Hume was wrong? Because thousands of years of Black culture have demonstrated otherwise. The Haitian Revolution demonstrates that Black people understood they were human beings because they fought for freedom, fought for liberty. So we have to be very careful. We can appreciate the interventions that we're making and discussions that we're having around race and racism. But we have to understand, well, what's the conditions and what's the environment by which we're having these? Are Black people becoming more self-determined in understanding the legacy of Hume? Or is it just another way for us to talk about Hume's mistake while saying, look at all the other wonderful stuff that he's done? Are Black people, Black philosophy being instituted to repair and change the paradigm of how Black people are not looked at as human beings? Because that argument, that idea still exists even in institutions like the University of Edinburgh. I work with people who still don't think Black people had philosophy, even though I'm a Black professor of philosophy, the first Black professor of philosophy.
Why would there be another? You said there would be another.
I'm sorry?
You said there would be another Black professor.
It's very likely that they may not, because there's still institutional discrimination.
But there may be. It's not that there won't be another.
No, I say there may not be.
Statistically, it's unlikely.
Yes, statistically, it's unlikely. If it took 400 years to get one, I mean, that's not great odds.
So like buses.
You know.
Then two come along at the same time.
Right, but see, but the point, this highlights the point. What is the basis of societal change? You see, if you think that a group of white people in a room changes the society, you're mistaken. I come from a country where white people claim that their hearts and minds were changed in '54 when they passed desegregation laws. Then again, everybody valorizes King in the 60s as if he somehow changed the course of America, and they celebrated the Voting Rights Act of '64. Then in '72, we had affirmative action. I was born in '79. By 1980, Reagan had already questioned whether or not Black people should be preferred given the histories of racism, enslavement, and segregation in that country. And you see that the rights that my people have fought for 50, 60 years, I'm only 45, is gone in my own lifetime. One president, 3 months, all the rights that black people are allegedly celebrated for are gone. So then what do you think happens in a country that doesn't have a big black population? What happens in a country where there are no black people that run governments? What happens in a country where there are no black professors in its institutions? Is that the basis for thinking that there's radical transformation and hope? Is it because we trust so dearly in the idea that we're having the conversation, that's the reward itself? We have to start thinking more carefully about how we're instituting black knowledge. We have to think more carefully about how black philosophers like Africana Horton, right, James McCune Smith, Frederick Douglass, they were the ones that created the first human philosophy. Because unlike their white oppressors like Hume, Dougal Stewart, etc., they didn't start their presumptions off of the fact that black people were animals and chattel to be owned and sold. You see, they built positive visions of black people because they were black people. They start off with the presumption that black people had philosophical thoughts because they were black people thinking philosophically. They understood that Hume was a racist, not because they had the debate about Hume, but because they understood that Hume introduced an idea that had never been introduced before outside of European society. Namely, that black people who existed thousands and thousands of years before them actually passed a legacy of knowledge out to other people in the 1800s, the 1900s, et cetera. You see, we have to change our perspective, people. And that perspective does not mean negotiating with your oppressors as if them admitting wrongdoing is the basis for you defining yourself and your history. Their wrongdoing is the exception and the exemption to the humanity that black people had for centuries. And I think that's where our conversations have to go from here on out.
So, thank you. I don't know how I follow on that. I assume that you possibly have said most things that could allow us to really have a great discussion. So I'm Irene, and I think my story, where do I start? There's the question where people ask you where you're from. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to tell you where I'm from to save you asking that question or thinking 100 different ways that you can ask me the question without offending me. So I was born... So I was born in Kenya, and when I think about the issues that Alex has, spoken there, and I think it's really important that we have these discussions because what they do is that they rehumanize us. We become close to one another, and we are able to actually see that our differences, whether imagined or situated in philosophy or institutions, are things that we can change. So my relationship with Scotland is a complicated one. I actually didn't think that I didn't consider my blackness until I actually came to Scotland. The idea of being black was not something that I had considered. And then suddenly I took on this new identity, and that identity also had huge amounts of stereotypes and assumptions that people make about, people that look like me. And in taking this identity is also the issues around, as Tommy was saying, these aren't just individual acts of people. We're all here, good people trying to do something. And I think when we stop to think that it's our individual acts that bring about that change, but also we are operating within structures. We are also operating within wider concepts that our own individual acts alone are not enough to actually bring about that change. And there's the issue of power, which is central to this. The power to name a thing, to call a thing, to decide that, I am going to come up with this footnote, which has allowed us this, time to discuss. And I'm thinking that if I was to rule the world, I would say that any public philosopher that wants to come up with an idea should bring it to the public square for discussion and for it to be checked and for us to think ahead about the ideas that we think about today and how some of these ideas would look like in 100 years' time and how problematic that can be. And I think, Alex, what you've done there, I think is really brave, because there's this idea that, we need to feel comfortable. But comfort actually, sometimes is saying, I want to cause you pain in some ways, but if you speak out, you're making me uncomfortable. And we need to sit in that discomfort, ask ourselves why we feel uncomfortable. And in part of that is also not being afraid to look at the past. And I think we need to allow ourselves to be surprised, to be surprised by the things that we are afraid of, to be surprised about some of the things that humanity has done. And the question there, the issue around slavery is that, the language really mattered there. And these were good Christians, these were enlightened people. So there was a justification, which I think was more evil and perhaps more barbaric than slavery itself, because whilst we think that this is a legacy, the legacy of that still lives today. It lives in our bodies. It lives in some of our everyday experiences. So when we say that this is very much in the past, it really, makes us want to be curious and to see curiosity as a radical act and a necessary one that allows us to ask questions, deep questions, not only about the past, but also what we can become by asking these questions and having these discussions. And that these legacies also can bring about relevant connections, the way we are connecting with each other here. And one of the things that I've learned, actually, sort of doing this work, is that I need to educate myself about Black British history and what that means, because coming from Kenya and coming here, although we may share the same identity, our experiences are completely different. And how do I remain curious to understand the stories of other people? And what can we do? And I like the idea of calling a thing a thing. You spoke about white supremacy, and that sounds very confronting. Perhaps something that if you say it enough, you would be seen as a radical. But if you really explore it, what does it mean? It's about systems, it's about structures, and it's around political power, social power, and economic power that allow for these supremacist ideas based on racial hierarchies, that this is what's supreme and what is this is what isn't. And how do we reframe that? And how do we change that narrative? How do we create a new story? Because I think we are human stories, we are stories. And I liked the point that the person whose name I've now forgotten, that he wrote rap and poetry. But I think rap is poetry. It's just that it's not been imagined as poetry, because poetry was perceived as something for sort of really intellectual, clever people. And rap was an expression used by Black people as a form of poetry. So I thought that was really interesting, and how those ideas intersect. So I think I'm going to stop because I think there's much more to hear from the audience.
I think we have a lot more to hear from the audience. Well done, Irene. Thank you very much. Just keep hold the microphone. Okay, so we have time now for a Q&A from the audience, and I'm looking for hands, and I can see one hand straight up there, Fiona.
I've got a microphone.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the panel for sitting and telling us about who you are and what you do. I feel I've been very educated. I wanted to ask Tommy about the fact that you mentioned about there won't be any more philosophers. And it got me thinking about, if somebody decided, if a child wanted to become a philosopher and they wanted to study philosophy, what would they learn here in Scotland? And please bear with me a second. I have a reason for asking this question, because of the education system. Now, if we think about the fact that a lot of West African countries, and not just West African countries, were colonized by the Brits, which meant that our educational systems was based on British educational system. However, when you walk through those glorious doors of that airport with that qualification, which your parents have probably sweat, paid, did everything for you to get it, and you say, I am coming to the UK to show you what I have learned and to implement that as part of this country, it is not accepted. It is considered inferior and not good enough. Then the second thing is that I am Sierra Leone. I am British, but I am very much born in Sierra Leonean. We grow up with families who tell us you got to be a doctor, a lawyer, or this or that. Those are the things that you were meant to do, because that sort of evens the playing fields. Now imagine a child going home and saying, I want to do philosophy. First and foremost, what the hell is philosophy? Is it going to pay your rent? Is it going to buy you a house? Those are the questions that are going to be asked. And if you have parents who are a little bit more open-minded and willing, what are you going to learn when you study philosophy?
So there's a few questions in there,
Yeah.
Tommy.
Yeah, so, well, listen, I come from a place where nobody would imagine any little black boy from Lake Charles becoming a philosopher, right? So I understand that pressure. Generally speaking, philosophy is not going to pay your rent and it's not going to buy you a home. You have to be extremely lucky to do that, okay? And there's practical concerns, and I tell my daughters, don't be philosophers. But the reason I tell them that, and this goes to your second question about what you will learn, in the United States, you would learn how to be a good liberal, because you would learn to advance arguments about black people that are very integrationist, assimilatory, and puts you basically on the democratic national platform. Philosophy here in this country, in Scotland, I think it's much more insidious, because you have a population of philosophy teachers that are like 99.9% white. And they teach you about how they view black people. So and I'll be very honest with you, I teach fourth year modules, I teach honors. So every time I get maybe one or two black people in my course, I have to explain to them why they should not base everything they understand about blackness on bell hooks or Crenshaw. And it's important because what they learn is to identify black people, especially black Americans, as hypersexual, hateful, and violent. And they do that from the perspective of elite white people who say these are the only insights we have about blackness. It's not until they get to my course they read Fanon, Nkrumah, Biko, etc. So the way that a black philosopher would learn about themselves here in Scotland would very much be to see themselves as a problem, to use Du Bois's right. So the only incentive you would have is to want to do analytic philosophy and then say, I'm not like other black people. And this is part of the problem that I see in the Scottish education system, is that it presents blackness only through the perspective of the shame it has for enslaving you. So black people don't have the same kind of race concept we have in America, because I come from a place in America where we have the Deacons for Defense, the Black Panthers, we have the Civil Rights Movement, right? We see a constant image of black people fighting against white supremacy. Over the 6 years I've been here, what I find are black people who are afraid to talk about themselves as black, because they don't associate blackness with a resistance tradition. They associate blackness with discrimination, shame, and enslavement. And that is furthered by the education system in Scotland. You learn about David Hume, they'll teach you about the footnote, and they say, oh, but Hume was great. So you're rewarded not for focusing on the footnote, but for saying, like the other white students, yeah, Hume is great, right? This is the problem of cultural alienation, right? Of the inferiority complex that Biko and Fanon talk about. You're learning the language of your oppressor, so you understand your consciousness of blackness through the lens by which white people define you. And my job for the time that I'm alive is to make sure that that doesn't happen, right?
Some activism there. Thank you, Tommy. Thank you. Any more questions?
I'd also encourage people in the spaces you find yourselves to ask how many non-white history teachers there are in Scotland, and keep asking that question. And I think you'd be maybe shocked, maybe not unsurprised about the number, because it'd be less than it's zero. It's zero. So history teachers in Scotland. Oh, sorry. Zero head
Or
teachers.
heads, right, okay.
So in the spaces that you find yourself, keep asking, who are the people at the front? Who are the people on the boards? Who are the people on the committees? I think it speaks to a couple of the points that have been raised. And we just keep this conversation going in the places you find yourself.
I might ask a couple of questions while we're here. I'm looking for hands as well, but if I see a hand, I'll glance over. Alex, I'd probably ask you about how do we keep conducting more productive discussions about the past? I mean, you've really delved into it. You've taken this personally. What should we do going forward?
I mean, we're in a strange time where, the simple phrase is the culture war, where every discussion about our past, which seems to inflame and polarize and put people aside, and the very profession of history teaching is, at secondary school level and at university level is under assault from politicians. It seems, I went to very expensive schools, such as my privilege. I was taught terrible history, propaganda of a North Korean style. I mean, the British abolished slavery. We were the heroes. It seems to me that if we continue to work hard at telling good, decent, true history that's properly informed, that is humble, and talks to those who feel excluded or are excluded, and so on. That really is the only way, and we just go on scratching away at the surface of that. It's absolutely crucial. There are so many lessons to be learned from all the story of British colonial oppression and imperialism, and from many other stories. One of the things working with reparations activists through my group, both in the Caribbean and in Britain, is one of the key things you hear is no repetition, and I mean some of you know that as a principle, and I don't think it's ever occurred to anyone. It hadn't occurred to me before that a repetition of the racist industrialized exploitation of people is perfectly feasible, and that's what we have to fight, and that's why we have to tell this story, and that's why reparation is one of the CARICOM list, the Caribbean nations list of 10 asks of the enslaving European nations. No repetition. Working to stop that is there, and that comes down to telling this story properly. I didn't really answer.
No, I think you gave a lot of points to it, because you're actually you've been quite clear on it. I think, Alex, so thank you very much. Irene, you do a lot of work in equity and inclusion, and Tommy's touched on this, what's going on in the States just now and the impact that does have, but how do we promote deeper thinking and understanding then, from your perspective and the work that you do?
There's the idea that, the mic. I think there is this idea that these are very complicated discussions, and people see them as having complexity. They're very difficult, they're from the past, and we can't talk about these issues, right? But I think we run the risk of making the complicated more complicated by we create complexity by not addressing issues around complexity. And we live in a world that is insistent in telling us how to think. If you look at the digital space, it tells you content for you. So you find that you're in very polarized spaces. So it tells you these are the people that we can like together, and also these are the people that we can hate together. So we are in a situation by you can live in an echo chamber where you only hear views that affirm your belief systems, right? And in terms of equity, we need to think about, when children are small, we say to them that we need to show them how to share properly, right? Why do we do that? So in terms of equity, it's about distribution. And the whole point is that it has to be at a structural level. What are we investing in? Who do our systems really value? So if you have 1 million investment in education, why don't we have more Black history teachers? Do the experiences of Black and brown children matter in schools? And if they do, and if we want more Tommys, how do we invest in that? So while we have very good sentiments about what we can do, we need to look at the structures
the systems that reproduce some, what you were saying, Alex, that we are not too far away from having industrialized, racist oppressions. But they exist, but in very subtle, subliminal ways, structures that oppress the excellence of black and brown children going to school, how they see themselves in proximity to who they can become. My mother was a teacher. I come from a family of teachers. And I wonder what would happen to me in terms of shaping my own perception if I was in a space where I could not see myself, I could not see anyone that looked like me, so anyone that can relate to my experience. And this goes across different sectors in terms of banking. The FTSE 100, if you look, I don't know, the increment is maybe 4% from the past 10 years. So what are we investing in? Who is responsible for that money? So I think organizations need to look beyond just saying, oh, these are the people from Bush University, so we can't bring them in. But if you look at universities, Tommy, and you can attest to this, the number of black, and brown graduates who are coming from the systems, why are they not being absorbed into the labor market? What is the issue there? It's one thing getting in. How are people getting on? How are you tracking that? We don't have the data, but you need to start somewhere. So I could go on about this, as you can tell.
A lot of passion from Irene. Okay, so we are now ready. There's no more questions, no more comments. I'd like to take a moment to thank the panel. Alex, Tommy and Irene, very much for your insight and your discussion points. Thank you very much.